Good evening all and welcome. I would like to give you fair warning before we start this episode. It is extremely dark. Obviously, emergency service workers have seen a number of truly traumatizing and horrifying things, many of which will be discussed in tonight's episode. One of them is unaliving yourself, and if this thought has ever crossed your mind, I just want to let you know that you truly are loved. Your impact in this world probably reaches far greater than you can possibly imagine. And if you weren't here anymore, you will be missed by plenty, and you have no idea how deeply your absence will be felt, not only by those who love you, but everyone else. There is a link to hotlines down below. You have been warned. It's gonna get dark. And a very happy birthday to Ria Falcon. I hope you've had a wonderful day. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I worked on a mine on Australia's west coast, and back in 2009, our mine emergency response team was called to an incident involving fishermen who had been washed off a popular fishing rock nearby Gareth's Rock. Luckily, we had a ship in port, which meant 3 tugboats were in the area and able to respond to the people in the water before we arrived. The port was about a 20-minute drive from the main site. When we arrived, we had to reverse the ambulance about 150 meters down the jetty, because it was only a single lane, and being able to leave without backing up was a priority. Myself, as the officer in charge, and 3 other medics grabbed our first response gear and extra thermal blankets and headed down to a lower boat landing. We were given flotation devices before we were allowed to board the tug. Once aboard, we were directed to the port side galley door, where 3 casualties were being looked after being pulled from the ocean about 2 hours earlier. Because the galley was so cramped, the 2 tug workers already inside had to step out and make room for us. They left through the starboard galley door and stayed outside, along with 3 or 4 more tug workers by the port side door and a few others elsewhere on the boat. When we entered, it took a moment to adjust to the light and layout. The port door was behind me, and the starboard door was on the right side of the room. To my right were 2 tables fixed against the wall, each with a bench seat on both sides and a table in the middle. In front of those booths was a narrow gap you could walk through to reach either the seat or the doors. I counted 3 people in the room. 2 of them were on the floor, one lying on his side directly in front of me, the other on his back halfway down the gap. Both were middle-aged men, with obvious cuts and scrapes from trying and failing to climb back up the reef. The 3rd casualty was an older man, sitting on the far table with his hands clasped in front of him, elbows resting on the tabletop, staring off into space. He had clear injuries too, cuts and other wounds that needed proper treatment, with blood congealment on the table beneath his hands. I directed the other medics where to go during triage, assigned each one of the men on the floor, while another medic and I attended the older man. One of the other medics told us that this was the man's father. Earlier, he had been extremely upset because his son had gone into the water after his mate was washed in, and he had apparently kept repeating that he had to bloody save his son. He had only gone quiet a few minutes before we arrived. We tried several times to speak with him, but he showed no interest in communicating. Between us, we decided shock or hypothermia was probably playing a role, so we tried to get a thermal blanket on him while I checked for primary vitals and any obvious life-threatening bleeding above or below the table. The older man then looked at my partner dead in the eyes and said, "You can't resolve this. You're just occupying my presence. You need to let me keep going." I looked at my partner in the same way we had looked at each other many times before, with hysterical or incoherent casualties. But this man was calm in a way that was deeply unsettling. He sat there with interlaced fingers and a deadpan voice, and for a few seconds we just stared at each other, waiting for one of us to take charge, which is pretty normal in that situation. After a few seconds, I managed to compose myself and told him he'd encountered a bit of mischief, that we needed to treat his injuries, and that he would be at the hospital and everything would move forward from there, and I told him to relax. Then, very suddenly, he stood up. The tabletop broke free of its base and slammed into my right leg. I do not mean it was rotten or badly fitted, I mean it made an audible crack as I saw him rise with force through his thigh, and the thing actually broke loose, shoving into me and pinning me against the back seat. My mate medic later told me that because the galley was so cramped, he reached out with one hand towards the casualty and the other on the table trying to stabilize it. The older man moved very quickly, pushed past my medic, and went out through the starboard galley door like a damn wind. I shoved the table forward, and both my partner and I followed him, only a second or two behind. But a search of the deck and a run up the stairs turned up nothing. No one outside on the galley saw him leave. There were stairs leading up to the wheelhouse where 6 or 7 senior people from the mining company were standing, and none of them saw anyone except us running up the stairs in the panic looking for him. When we got back to the galley, the man who had handed us our flotation devices before boarding was still on dock and said no one had passed him. The captain of the tug had stayed behind the controls the whole time because he needed to keep the bow of the tug against the dock. 3 other deckhands were outside the doors, port and starboard, with a full view of the lower deck, and all of them said they never saw anyone leave after we medics went in. We went back to the galley, still weirded out, but treated the other 2 casualties and then transferred them to the hospital. During the debrief, only my partner, myself, and one of the other medics could verify that the older man had even been in the room. The 4th medic had no memory of him at all, though she thought she was just too focused on her own patient. The tug crew reported only 2 people recovered from the water, and there was never any mention of a 3rd casualty. I tried afterwards to speak to the men in hospital to get some answers and find out whether they'd seen him or whether the older man had really been one of their fathers. But after 2 consecutive day shifts and the day before I went on night shift, I finally got around to going to the hospital and found out they had already been discharged. My brother-in-law works at that hospital, and he said there was nothing unusual about either of them. One was apparently just incredibly relieved to be alive, while the other mostly sat quietly looking out the window not eating much. To this day, I still have no idea what the hell happened. My partner and I only rarely talk about it now and then when we're drunk. That's all we can really do. I grew up in rural Western Australia, and this happened when I was 19 and active in the local volunteer fire and rescue service. I think the year was 1999, though the exact date feels fuzzy now, which is frustrating because the memory itself is so clear. I was still living and working in the town I had grown up in. I had also spent years involved in sport, including field hockey at state level, but firefighting and rescue work was what really mattered to me. I joined the active ranks when I was 16 after spending the years before that as a junior in their running team, which was its own intense kind of sport. I had gone to a nearby town for a field hockey game and ran into an old mate called Walter. We had been in the state hockey squad together and were close a few years earlier, but we had both moved on from that scene and into work. So we had no idea we were only about 80 kilometers apart until that day. After that game, we naturally ended up spending the evening together catching up over drinks and enjoying each other's company. By midnight, the bar was closing, and we walked out to our cars, which happened to be parked close together. Even though we were both drunk, we were each planning on driving home. Mine was about 80 kilometers away, down a fairly straight unsealed road, whereas Walter had a much longer drive, 175 kilometers back to his farm, using the standard route past my town, and then cutting down another long stretch of highway. I wish I could say we had some moment of clarity and realized driving after that many beers was a terrible idea. But we did not. It was common enough back then, though I would never defend it now. We leaned on the boot of his red Commodore, talked, laughed, and finished our last beer. I remember giving him plenty of shtick about his personalized number plate, Crafty, which came from an old hockey nickname because he was so good at handling the ball that he caught people by surprise. We said we'd catch up again soon, and went our separate ways. I got home without trouble, probably just before 1:30 a.m, after dodging the rural cop gauntlet. I showered and went into bed. And then my phone rang for a second before stopping. There was a missed call from Walter, so I just assumed he had ended up in my town and wanted to keep the night going. I tried calling him back, but it ran out a few times, so I gave up and went to sleep. Later, I woke up to a burst of text messages. It was around 2:30 a.m. and they were all from Walter, but the messages were complete gibberish, like strings of nonsense, like someone's finger had slipped across the keyboard. I tried calling again, but after a few attempts I sent him a message saying there was a room at my place if he needed to crash, and that I could even get my girlfriend to come and collect him, even though we would both be wrecked for doing it. I still got no reply. At 2:19 a.m, my fire brigade pager went off. There had been a motor vehicle accident on the bypass south of town. The exact location was unknown, but it was about 2/3 of the way along the main stretch, and a telecommunications van with yellow flashing lights had called it in. I was still a bit under the weather, so I declined to attend out on the first call. But then they sounded the brigade siren repeatedly and paged us again. It was obvious they did not have enough people turning up, so I got dressed, and my girlfriend took me to the station, which was only a few minutes away. When I arrived, I was the officer in charge, because I was the third in command and nobody above me was there. We only had 4 firefighters, 5 including me. I assigned everyone their tasks and explained that I had had a few beers earlier, but I would not have come out if I thought I was unfit to perform. I told them I would not drive any appliances, but I was comfortable acting as OIC. If anyone had a problem with that, they could speak up, and I would gladly hand over command and leave. To be blunt, the rest of them were not exactly experienced. None of them really knew what the hell was going on, and the most senior had only been there for about 18 months and had only finished his introduction to firefighting a few months earlier. I won't drag this out, but we took the main pump with 3 of us in the cab and 2 others in the fast-track 4WD and headed for the scene. Expecting it to be about 40 minutes away, about 20 minutes in, we intersected with the bypass and began heading down it. By then, the cold air had sobered me up a bit, and I was expecting something relatively minor, maybe a rolled car, maybe not so much damage at all, especially since operations haven't given us any updates. I saw the yellow flashing lights long before we got there, and once we arrived, everything changed. It was obvious from the marks in the road. The car had lost control and plowed through a stock fence. Beyond that, there were huge gouges in the paddock and red paint smeared up the side of a small dam. I could not see into it from the road, but there was a man in a reflective vest standing on the bank waving a torch. I got out, assigned to the other 4 firefighters, and then did my 360-degree assessment. I walked up the bank and met the man in the vest. He was frantic, speaking a mile a minute about making huge gestures with his torch. Every now and then the light would catch a partially submerged license plate upside down because the car was on its roof in the middle of the dam. Only the back wheels, exhaust pipe, and plate were visible. The plate spelled Crafty. As a first responder, you go into a certain mode during an emergency. Your training takes over, your instincts take over, and you just do your job. It is later in the shower or at dinner, or some other quiet moment, when it comes back and reminds you that you're human. But I became human right there. I knew the car that had been in the dam for at least 2 hours because frost had already formed over the track leading to it. I walked the edge looking for signs that Walter had been thrown clear, but found nothing. Then I turned back to the car itself, 3/4 submerged, and I remember saying, "Oh, mate," in the saddest voice I have ever heard come out of my own mouth. A tow truck arrived at around the same time, and the driver said he could drag it out with a chain and deal with it later in the paddock. I did not think that was acceptable. I was also working as a swimming pool manager at the time, so I was a lifeguard too, and felt I should go in and bring my friend out with some dignity before the car was recovered. So at about 4 in the morning, in the middle of winter, at about 6 degrees Celsius, I stripped down to my underwear and waded into the dam. I really hoped I was about to pull out a car thief or a stranger rather than my mate, though I knew deep down that probably wasn't going to be the case. I had an intrinsically safe torch in my right hand, tied off with a lanyard around my wrist. I steadied myself with my left hand on the car's chassis, took 8 deep breaths, and then dived under towards what I assumed was the driver's side. It was hard to orient myself because the car was upside down and the driver's window was still intact, which was not helpful. I came up for air and went back down, eventually finding the door handle and getting the door open, which was lucky because I had expected the mud to stop it. I braced my back against the A-pillar and used my legs to push the door wider. I surfaced again, took a few minutes to control my breathing and then went back down. I had to hold the torch to my temple and could only see about 15 or 20 centimeters in front of me. Then I entered the driver's side. I cannot fully describe the horror of being face to face in that dark water with the white, dead face of a friend, eyes slightly open, his jaw so badly broken his mouth looked deformed. I jerked back hard and hit my head on the roof. Then something strange happened. I felt calm. I knew it was just a task. Somehow it felt like Walter was calling me a coward for flinching. I put my left arm over his hanging arms and started feeling for the seatbelt. But because he was upside down, I had trouble finding the buckle in the dark. I went back up for air and returned again, still searching. When I finally found the buckle, I could not release the seatbelt. No matter how hard I pressed the button or pulled, it wouldn't come free. I was running out of air, but I did not want to surface again because I knew I might not be able to find the buckle a second time. I thought I was so close that 1 more second would do it. Eventually, the buckle finally released. I tried to push back out through the door and surface, but my right wrist snagged on something in the car. I tried to yank free, but the lanyard was too strong. The torch flapped wildly, lighting up parts of the dashboard and Walter's upper legs and bare stomach, which only made me panic more. I was already short on air, and now I was doing that awful gulping motion everyone knows when they've held their breath for too long. I was getting scared. Then I just stopped. Not for any dramatic reason, I simply stopped fighting it. It felt as though I was no longer gasping for air, no longer dying for air. I calmly thought I should just point the torch at whatever was snagged, free myself and let go. When I grabbed the torch and aimed it at my wrist with my left hand, I saw the lanyard had wrapped itself around the unclasped seatbelt buckle I had just undone. I knew exactly what the problem was and was trying to loosen it but couldn't manage it. It felt like warmth spreading over me, and for a few seconds the fear returned because I was still trapped. Then, time seemed to stop. The torch was flapping around my grip, and while I was concentrating on the snag, I looked up and saw Walter's face illuminated. He was staring right into me, with open eyes and a slight smile. It was as if he was saying, "It's okay. You don't need to worry about this. I've got your back. Just let me sort it out and I'll get you out of trouble like always." Then, his hand moved, unhooked the tangled lanyard, And then, for lack of a better word, he left. After I surfaced, coughing and trying to get my lungs working again, I looked at the bank and saw the other firefighters screaming and pointing. One of them had already jumped into the water and was right there with me, frantic. After I brought Walter out and onto the bank, and he was taken to the ambulance, I started helping to clear the scene and talking to the others. That was when I found out what had happened from their side. While I had been going under and surfacing, they had apparently lost track of me. When too much time passed without me coming back up, they got increasingly worried. I explained that the lanyard had gotten stuck and that I had to free it, but I left out what I had experienced inside the car. They would not let it go. They said I had been underwater for over 15 minutes, and after only about a minute, the others had stripped off and dived in after me. He still tells me he grabbed my legs and put his feet against the car but couldn't move me. He said he dove down repeatedly to feel around for whatever was holding me but never found anything. He also swears he ran his finger down both my arms because they were the only parts he thought might be trapped. After that, I woke up every morning at 2:19 a.m. for months. Then Walter visited me in a dream and told me that it was not my fault and that I needed to forgive myself. I have never woken up at 2:19 a.m. again. I miss my friend every day. Trigger warning. This story contains mentions of unaliving yourself. I am a paramedic and have been working in emergency medicine for about 10 years. My career has been spent answering 911 calls and providing advanced life support for severe illnesses and injuries. The range of calls is huge. Sometimes we are called for things that do not really need an ambulance at all, while other times we are minutes away from death, and sometimes already too late. This story is going to be dark, and I want to say that up front. It involves graphic detail, and I know that might be difficult for some people to hear. I'm not going to soften what happened, because the reality of it matters. As awful as it was, I want to turn it into something useful if I can. I want it to serve as a reminder, maybe even to help someone, before it's too late. But first, a little background. After paramedic school, I had been working for a few years already. The service I worked for was based in a city. We covered the entire county, which was mostly rural. In schools, you go on long rides and learn under preceptors, sort of like a residency or internship. That's where you get your early exposure to the job. Sometimes on those ride-alongs you'll get serious calls, and they are terrifying because you're still learning, but at least you have someone beside you to catch mistakes and guide you. Other times, you're lucky enough not to see the worst of it early on. That can feel like a blessing, but it also means there are things you have not yet experienced before you are on your own. We used to talk about the two kinds of people in the field. We called them white cloud and black cloud. A white cloud is someone who always seems to miss the big calls, the exciting ugly stuff when they're just off shift, or out of area, or on another truck. A black cloud is the opposite. When I was in school, I was definitely a white cloud. I had a few cardiac arrests, a few bad wrecks, but nothing especially memorable. Even a couple of years into my career, that same luck seemed to follow me around. That doesn't mean I had bad calls. I had. But this one was different. It took place on Christmas Eve. I was working 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. Christmas Eve into Christmas Day, and as far as I remember, the day was fairly quiet. Most people were home with family instead of out causing trouble or getting into accidents. That shift, I was working with the charge medic and a brand new EMT who was in field training. A few of my co-workers had made Christmas dinner, so we had hot food to eat while we were stuck at the station away from our families. We had 2 ambulances. There were 2 crews, myself, my partner, and our trainee on one side, and the other crew on the other. At night, if a call came into our station, the crew would rotate so everyone got a little more sleep. It must have been around 11 p.m. or so when I was sitting in a recliner watching television. This is when a call came through that sent us out into the country. One of the guys from the other crew, who was a friend of mine, had fallen asleep in the chair next to me, so I took the call. The original report was a woman who had fallen and struck her head. She was conscious and breathing, so we went emergent. It was probably about a 15-minute drive to the address. As we got closer, dispatch updated us that the patient was now unconscious but still breathing. When we pulled into the neighborhood, I immediately noticed how strange the scene looked. There were lights everywhere. Sheriffs, deputies, police, fire department, all of them already on scene, with some blocking the entrance to the street. For what was supposed to be a simple head injury? It was an odd amount of activity, and the whole call suddenly felt wrong. One of the deputies saw us approaching and moved his car so that we could get through. The street ended in a cul-de-sac with houses all around it, and people were out on their front porches watching what was happening. We reached the address. There was a car in the driveway still running, surrounded by officers. The driver's side door was open, and an officer was standing there, apparently talking to someone in the driver's seat. My partner and I approached with our EMT trainee behind us, and as I got to the rear of the vehicle, I could tell there was definitely someone inside. There was a middle-aged man in plain clothes, standing near the front of the car, his lower half lit by the headlights. His hands were in his pockets, and he was staring hard at the person inside. I went up to the officer and got the report while I was looking at the patient. The woman in the driver's seat looked to be in her 40s or 50s. She was leaned back against the headrest, arms hanging down and eyes closed. She was breathing. I could hear her moaning, but she wasn't speaking. There was blood running down from her head across her cheek and towards her chin, as well as blood coming from her nose. The officer told me she had been inside with the family, then came out to the car for something. Her husband, the man standing in front of the vehicle, had come out because she had been outside for a while. Then he saw she was bleeding, and assumed he had fallen or hit her head or something and called 911. He also told me she had not been responding to anything he had said to her. I tried talking to her and got no response other than moaning. I performed a sternum rub to try and get a pain response but got nothing. I asked her husband whether she had been drinking or using drugs. He said that she had had a few glasses of wine but nothing else that he knew of. At that point, I was thinking head injury, possibly an intracranial bleed because she was not responding appropriately. I stayed at the driver's door while I kept assessing her. I could not see where the blood was coming from, so I assumed she had a scalp injury or something hidden in her hair. That's when the officer came back up to me and said, "We also found this in the driver's side door compartment," and he handed me a revolver. I looked at the officer, then at the gun. He was holding it out to me, so I took it and opened the cylinder, already thinking, oh crap. Inside was one brass casing with the primer struck. A round had been fired. That changed everything. Based on the blood and that new information, I assumed she had put the gun up to her temple or something similar. The fact that she was still breathing and making noise made me think she'd either missed or the bullet had traveled in some odd way because of the angle. Because of the likelihood of serious head trauma, I decided we needed to immobilize her neck as well, just in case there was spinal involvement. I asked one of the firefighters to bring me a collar from the ambulance. I opened the back door and got into the vehicle behind her so I could hold her head still while the firefighter applied the collar. That's when I saw what was really happening. As I slid behind her, I got a clear view of the back of her head. It was something I will never forget. There was a hole in the back of her head about the size of a grapefruit. When I shined my flashlight into it, it was nearly empty except for a large piece of skull floating on top of a mess of blood and brain tissue. I looked up and saw the headliner of the car was splattered with a 2-foot-wide halo of blood and brain matter, with tiny pieces of skull embedded in the fabric. Then I looked back at the wound. It was cold enough outside that I could actually see heat vapor coming out that hole, the same way you can see your breath on a chilly day. I looked out at my partner and said, We need to go. Now." Whether it was the look on my face or just instinct, he leaned in to look for himself. His eyes went wide and all he said was, "Holy crap." Our trainee went back to the ambulance, grabbed a stretcher and a backboard, and up to that point we had been moving carefully. After what we saw, carefully turned into "get her out now." He had also brought some trauma dressing and gauze wrap. I covered the wound and wrapped her head as tightly as I could so nothing would spill out when we moved her. With help from the fire department and police, we got her onto the backboard and then onto the stretcher. All the while, the husband stood at the front of the car watching, not understanding what had happened. When we were loading her, he came over and I could see tears in his face. He bent down, kissed her cheek and said, "I love you." And then we got her into the ambulance. Because of the injury, most of the cerebrum was essentially gone. That meant no real motor function, no meaningful muscle tone, no cognitive ability. But the brainstem was still intact, which meant the body could still carry out basic automatic functions like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. That is why when we moved her, her tongue fell back against her airway and blocked it. I knew it was going to happen, so I had my apartment get the intubation equipment ready. Inside the ambulance, I used the laryngoscope to open her airway and move the jaw and tongue forward. I could see the hole in the roof of her mouth. I passed the endotracheal tube through the vocal cords and into the trachea so we could ventilate her properly. My partner placed an intraosseous line for access. It works like an IV except it goes into the bone and lets medication and fluid absorb through the marrow. I put her on the monitor, checked her blood pressure and oxygen, and what struck me as odd was that her vitals were actually decent. Her blood pressure was good, her heart rate was normal, her oxygen was good, her rhythm was normal. We transported emergently and called ahead to activate the trauma team. After the call, we went back to the station to restock and clean up. That was when I noticed the bits of bone and blood on my clothes. Luckily, the charge medic let me go home, shower and change, and after that I came back to work and the rest of the shift was uneventful. The next morning around 9 a.m, I learned the family had decided to remove life support, and she died. For years after that, I did not think the call had affected me all that much. I kept working and kept doing what I knew to do. I didn't really believe that it had carried with me. Then, a few years ago, I was in a bad relationship that forced me to look more closely at myself. It made me think about who I was and why I was the way I was. A lot of what I had always thought was just my personality started to look different. I realized how angry I often was. I was not cruel, but small, stupid things would set me off. My temper was bad. I was cynical about the world, still am honestly, and what I thought was a stomach problem started to look more and more like anxiety. I decided I wanted to figure out why. Why do I think the way I think? Why do I react the way I react? So I went to see a psychologist. After months of appointments, the diagnosis returned. PTSD. I hated hearing that at first. I didn't want to be labeled that way. It did not fit the image I had of myself. I can handle anything. Or so I told myself. Nothing gets to me. But during those conversations, that Christmas Eve call kept coming up again and again. I had not realized how much it had actually affected me. I had built a wall around myself to keep other people out and keep from seeing how much it hurt to protect myself. The more I sat with that, the more it made sense. I tell the story in so much detail because I want people to understand how mental health affects not just one person, but everyone around them. And I know I'm getting preachy here, but this part matters. Because one of the biggest cause of deaths amongst first responders is them taking their own lives. If you have ever thought about doing that or tried it before, I need you to understand. It does not just affect you. You may think it would be better for everyone, but it will not be. People often call suicide selfish, and as harsh as that sounds, the pain it causes is real. Once you are gone, you do not get to see how many lives you've changed. If you think nobody would care, please understand that people do. I care. So talk to someone, anyone. Be honest about what you're feeling. I know that is hard. It was hard for me too. But it can get better. You just have to try. I was at a thrift store with some friends, shopping for Halloween costumes, when someone came in and said there was a person passed out in the parking lot. I was in the dressing room when everything suddenly got quiet. So I stepped out and told them I was certified and that I could go check and that they needed to dial 911. When I got outside, I did not see anyone on the ground. Then someone came out and yelled that the person was actually in the car parked off by itself far from the store. I ran over and honestly freaked out. She was basically already gone, slumped against the window with her face completely blue. She had the usual red rings around her eyes that you see on drug users, but even those looked blue because she was so badly oxygen deprived. We opened the door, and I will never forget that when we turned her head to check for a pulse, tears were running down her face. We pulled her out of the car, laid her on the ground, and checked again because the first person who felt for a pulse was not sure. We started CPR, and the ambulance arrived about a minute later. They loaded her up and kept doing CPR in the ambulance. Another ambulance came too, and then there were about 6 EMTs around her. The cops told us they had given her some kind of drug that can reverse heroin overdoses if it's given in time, but she was almost already certainly beyond that point. They would keep doing what they could until they got to the hospital and then call it, according to him. I also remember that when we opened the car door, there were heroin needles and empty pill bottles all over the floor. She wasn't old either. We also think she may have had kids, because there were toys and a car seat in there, along with 2 names tattooed on her arm. Yeah, it was a rough few days afterwards, but I realized that in that situation there's honestly not much else anyone could have done. At least, she didn't die completely alone. I was an EMT for a while, and we got a call for what seemed like a straightforward but ugly bike crash. The report was that someone had been riding at breakneck speed, then smashed headfirst into a parked car without wearing a helmet. We got there immediately, and even though it was broad daylight in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday, the street was completely empty. No one had come out to check on the guy, which seemed unusual, because accidents like that draw crowds almost instantly. The cyclist was in bad shape. His skull looked badly smashed in. He was unresponsive and was bleeding heavily. He had lost some teeth and had a little road rash, but thankfully not a lot of skin damage. It was honestly the sort of injury most people do not survive. If they did, they would usually be left severely disabled. Normally, we would have moved him out of the road right away, but with a head and neck injury, that is risky. My partner, who was also training me because I was still new, went to check for a pulse while I started unloading our gear. He crouched down, felt for a while, and then stood up as if he was about to say something, when suddenly the guy jumped to his feet. He did not push himself up with his arms, he just got up fast. It shocked both of us. He looked at us, smiled, and tried to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we did not exactly want to wrestle a badly injured head trauma patient to the ground. He got away from us and ran into the woods without the bike. My partner was even more stunned than I was. He just stared at him, mouth open, then turned to me and said, "The guy had no pulse, man." I asked if he was sure, and he swore the guy had been clinically dead. We called law enforcement for help, and they sent search and rescue into the woods. I never found out whether they found him or not, because once the professionals take over, field crews usually do not hear much after that. This happened in the Pine Barren, so there was plenty of ground to search. My best guess is that he went to a family member's house in a confused state. But those head injuries usually bleed like crazy, so I would have expected a trail of blood for the police to follow. For clarity, I'm not an EMT anymore. I only did it for about a year before deciding the medical field was not for me and switched to computer science. I'm an EMT. When you're working with a patient, you end up filtering out a lot of background noise. But there have been 2 occasions that have stayed with me. The first was a woman who was 9 months pregnant and had an altered level of consciousness. We arrived on the scene, she looked at me and my crew and said, "Take care of him," and then she coded. We went to work immediately, got her on the trauma bay, and rolled her in while I was still doing chest compressions. OB performed an emergency C-section while the rest of us kept working the code. The newborn was worked on, a helicopter landed on the pad for transport, and the whole scene turned into a blur. The mother was pronounced soon after, and then we learned the newborn was pronounced in flight. We did everything we could, but they both still died. And as a father, that one hit hard. This second one still keeps me up at night. It was a man whose truck had wrapped around a steel pole, which caused a fuel leak and set the passenger compartment on fire. We got there early enough in the rescue to hear him screaming. We pulled out the hearse tools and started working, but I watched him die before I could get the A-post off enough to free his pinned legs. After that, the extrication still took about 20 minutes because the wreckage was so badly mangled. Watching a man burn is something that never really leaves you, and if I close my eyes and am quiet, I swear I can still hear the screams in my head. I was working as a paramedic at the time, and our service covered a mental hospital in the area. They knew they were not supposed to call us for routine transports, so if they called, it had to be something they believed was an actual emergency. So one night we were dispatched there for a possible stroke on the 4th floor. We already knew the floor housed patients who had been committed for serious crimes, and that police officers would be going in with us. When we arrived, the nurse looked at us like we were about to walk straight into trouble. She told us the patient would not stop looking to the left, which was the reason she had called it a possible stroke, and that she kept talking to someone. When we entered the room, the woman was in a full conversation with something outside the window. We asked her to speak to us and she went quiet. We loaded her onto the stretcher and the officer cuffed her to it. Once we got outside, she looked back towards the window, then suddenly snapped her head to the other side and said it was so cool how fast they fly. About 5 minutes from the hospital, she asked me whether I was worried the ambulance was about to break down so that her and her flying yellow friends could kill us. I told her no, and she let out the most chilling, screeching laugh I have ever heard. The officer had gone as white as a sheet and didn't say a word to her. We dropped her off in the ER, came back outside, and the ambulance had been shut off and would not start. I went back inside to ask the officer if he had turned it off, but they said no. The officer had come inside with us. We couldn't find him, so dispatch sent a bunch of units to look for him, but he was not at the hospital. They eventually found him sitting in his cruiser back at the mental hospital and couldn't remember how he got there. To this day, I really think she and the officer saw something. I was a student at the time, third manning with my team leader and a medic, when we got called to an overdose. We went flying over there with the lights and sirens on. When we arrived at the house, we found a man and a woman sitting in a tense, frosty silence. After questioning them, it turned out one of them had called the ambulance because during an argument, she had said she was going to overdose. Things started to get a little bit heated, so we asked him to leave for a few minutes while we spoke to her alone. There was a whole unfortunate backstory to this woman that was irrelevant to what happened that day, but enough to say she seemed like a decent person who had some serious problems and was trying to do right by her kids. We double-checked with her in private to make sure there had not been any violence, and she said there had not been any that day or before. The creepy part was when the guy came back inside. At that point I was basically redundant. My team leader was speaking with both of them, and the medic was making notes about the medication the woman was taking. I was not doing anything useful, and 3 of us were not really needed there, so I just watched that guy. Little things kept putting me on edge. He kept saying he would hold onto her medication so she wouldn't overdose. It did not sound like a simple concern to me. He also made a big deal about how all this fuss meant we could be out saving lives, even though he was the one who had called the ambulance in the first place. The whole time his manner seemed like he was trying very hard to come across as affectionate and caring. At one point, he put his arm around her and she didn't even react. He moved closer and still nothing. Then he moved closer still and she kept ignoring him. He gave her a kind of squeeze, but it felt completely out of place. Right after that, he looked at me straight in the eyes and turned away and lit a cigarette. I consider myself pretty well adjusted. I have dealt with creepy hallucinations from mentally ill people, gore, and death without falling apart. But something about that moment of eye contact shook with me. There was never enough there to act on, nothing I could report to social services or the police, but I still think about her now and then, and I hope wherever she is, she's doing okay. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I were staying at my mum's house while she was out of town. My old bedroom was in the basement, so that's where we planned to sleep. Around 2:30 a.m., I came back to bed after watching TV. My girlfriend was already out cold and I had just turned off the light and started getting under the covers when we heard a massive thud from upstairs. This was no ordinary thud. It was so heavy and deep that it seemed to shake the whole house. My girlfriend, who is an incredibly heavy sleeper, woke up to the sound and saw me standing there pale as a sheet, staring at her. I need to explain just how loud the noise was. My first thought was that either someone had driven a vehicle into the house, someone had smashed the front door with a sledgehammer, or the grand piano upstairs had somehow fallen through the floor. As you can imagine, we were both terrified. I immediately locked the bedroom door, grabbed a baseball bat, and my girlfriend grabbed the cordless phone and went into the closet. I know it sounds like overkill, but in that moment we were absolutely convinced somebody was inside. She called 911 while I stood there with the bat. The operator told us to stay on the line while police were dispatched. A few minutes later, the call dropped. We both panicked, thinking the line had been cut, but almost immediately the phone rang again. It was the police, saying they were outside. The officer told me, "Here's the plan. We're going to walk the perimeter of the house, look for any signs of forced entry, and if we don't find any, we'll ring the doorbell 3 times and you can come upstairs and let us in, okay?" I agreed. After a few minutes of silence, I heard the doorbell ring 3 times. That was probably one of the scariest moments of my life, but I unlocked the basement door and ran through the dark up the stairs and up the front door. When I opened it, I saw several police officers outside, and cars, including an undercover unit with K9s, parked on the street and on the lawn. The officer told me to grab my girlfriend and pets we had, so I did. We came outside, and they brought the K9s up to the door. The police officer shouted and then released the dogs. After several minutes of searching, the lead officer came back and told us that they had found no one inside the house, and that all roads leading to and from the house had been blocked off, and they were stopping any vehicles that tried to pass through. We felt so awful for causing such a scene, but he told us we had done the right thing. I still have nightmares about that night. Whatever made that noise will always be a mystery to me. What on earth was it? I work as an emergency medical courier. Hospitals and retirement homes run out of supplies and medication more often than people would expect, and a lot of the time I'm delivering blood, organs or surgical equipment to an ER while someone is on the table with a gunshot wound or a stabbing. I have had calls where a heart transplant needed blood immediately or the patient would have died. There must have been a lot of gangs in my town because I stayed busy. Or maybe a lot of people were making terrible health choices. Either way, I digress. I only work nights because it's easier to travel and get where I need and go much faster. So let me set the clock back 2 weeks. I got a call to pick up blood from the Red Cross and deliver it to a hospital in Paoli, Indiana. Easy enough. It was only about an hour and a half drive. I grabbed my keys and my service pistol. I'm a veteran with a concealed carry permit, and I never leave home without it. I headed out to pick up the red blood cells and get to the Red Cross before midnight. I showed my badge, signed for the blood, and loaded it up. Everything was fine. The roads were clear, the weather was decent, and aside from a few trucks, there was nearly no traffic. I crossed the bridge into Indiana and headed west on Highway 150 towards Paoli with the blood in the back seat. I set the cruise control, put on some music, and settled in, and then the weather turned. A light drizzle started, the fog rolled in, and the visibility dropped. It was pitch black out there, with no streetlights on those long country roads, when suddenly 2 large deer stepped into the road right in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires locked on the wet pavement, and I hit both of them head-on. My car was wrecked. I called dispatch and told them what happened. Now I was stuck in the middle of nowhere with blood that needed to get to the hospital immediately. I called AAA for a tow and waited. My car was in complete disarray and my whole livelihood depended on being able to drive. The deer ran off in the opposite direction while I got out with a flashlight and looked over the damage. It was 20 degrees out, and the heat in my destroyed car wasn't working anymore. Eventually, I got the car and myself back home. I ordered parts and spent days trying to save my work vehicle because I also had a family and needed it for everyday life. I was out of work until I could make the repairs. I replaced what I could. Radiator, fan, clutch, coolant reservoir, the works, and I spent days freezing outside, bending metal, stomping on the hood, and replacing everything I needed to get that thing working again. Finally, it got started, and at last I could resume my work. The weekend came, and I went back on the road. Things felt normal again, and I was happy to be making the money I needed to provide for my 2-year-old son. After work, I came home exhausted and tried to catch a quick nap before my next shift. My wife was busy talking to the kids and doing last-minute laundry because we were about to move and our lease was almost up. I had been driving for 14 hours and was cold out. Then I woke up with a monster on top of me making loud noises. At first, I was disoriented and panicking, trying to figure out what was happening. It was my German Shepherd Odin. He was 2 years old and 75 pounds. His barking was loud enough to put me in a frenzy. I looked around and saw nothing but thick black smoke everywhere. I grabbed my phone and then turned on my flashlight, but couldn't see an inch in front of me. I was in t-shirt and shorts, and Odin and I started downstairs to get out. I couldn't breathe properly because I was inhaling the worst smoke and fumes I'd ever smelled. Once we got outside, I called 911 while coughing and slowly losing consciousness. Then I realized our 5-pound terrier was still inside. The operator made it clear that I was not to go back in the house and that I needed to wait for the fire department. I had no idea how long they would take, and Odin jumped in the driver's seat of my old Ford Ranger and I ran back into the smoke. The basement was on fire. Visibility was completely gone and the smoke was toxic. I was yelling for my dog using my phone's flashlight while the operator stayed on the line telling me to get out. As I made my way upstairs, I felt something brush against me. I kept on going, found Dillinger, and got the hell out of there. The moment we made it outside, the flames were already rising. My wife and kids were pulling up at the same time. She was screaming and freaking out while I handed her the dog and collapsed on the ground. What felt like hours later, the fire department and EMS showed up. 2 big firefighters carried me to the back of the ambulance while I watched a whole crew suit up with masks, axes, and huge hoses before rushing into my burning home. I could hear my wife yelling and my 2-year-old crying for me. At some point, I felt pressure against my ribs and something soft against my mouth. I later realized the EMS workers were doing CPR and chest compressions while I kept fading in and out. By the time I was awake again in the back of the ambulance, firemen and investigators were asking me questions, and I was coughing and choking and could barely give them anything useful. I was still confused about what had happened because I had been asleep right before all of it started. I tried to go inside and collect a few things, but learned they had cut the power and that we couldn't stay there anymore. I wanted to grab what I could salvage, but I was furious and helpless. They wanted to take me to the hospital, and I yelled at them about how I was supposed to leave my family behind with no roof over their heads in this freezing weather and no food. Eventually they let me sign off, though they warned me I should get checked out because smoke inhalation can have some delayed side effects. The fire department later told me the dryer had somehow malfunctioned and caught fire, but I know what really happened. The lint tray was empty, and the plug was untouched and undamaged. They were all baffled by it, and even the firefighters took notes and checked the model for recalls. I do not have proof, but there is no logical explanation that makes sense to me. I now know something evil has been haunting me. 2 days later, I was cleaning out the house, salvaging what I could, throwing away everything I couldn't. Thankfully, I had renter's insurance, and they sent emergency funds so we can get a roof over our head and food on the table, and we stayed in a hotel while I went through the wreck covered in soot. Then I heard from the fire investigator that if Odin had not woken me when he did, I would have been dead within minutes. I am grateful for 2 things: renter's insurance and my best friend Odin the German Shepherd, and I showered the dog with every treat he deserved. I have not slept properly in days, and nearly died simply from trying to rest before work. I'm now terrified every time I lay down. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. For those of you who made it to the end, well done. I appreciate tonight's stories were especially dark and very real, and if you enjoyed it, I would love for you to let me know. Remember that unaliving yourself is not a great thing to do, and you would be incredibly missed by everyone around you. I can tell you this from personal experience, by the way. If you ever thought that you weren't loved or no one wanted you around, please know you're profoundly wrong, and you will always be missed, no matter how trivial you think your existence is. So again, links down below to hotlines if you feel the need to call, and it is always worth calling, believe me. But I would like to finish on a slightly more positive note and thank my amazing members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen, for their incredible support. And if you would like to support Mort, you can follow the links down below to find out what to do and what cool perks you get. But I'm going to wrap things up here. Stay safe out there, friends, and until next time, good night.